Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor Trevor Logan. And Professor Trevor Logan is a distinguished academic. He achieved tenure at a relatively young age. So Trevor, apparently your interests are quite diverse, and today we're going to be talking about Reconstruction and Black politics. And the title of your article is White Lashing, Black Politicians, Taxes, and Violence. What was Reconstruction?
Reconstruction is the period immediately after the Civil War where the states of what had been constructed as the Confederacy were repatriated to the United States government. It causes a couple of frictions because one of the key tenets of the Civil War itself was that states cannot secede from the Union. Like that once you're a state and you're in the United States, acknowledged as a state, you have representatives in Congress, you can't subsequently leave the Union. So the end of the Civil War presented this problem of how do you actually acknowledge the fact that these states tried to leave so that they have to rejoin the Union at the same time saying that they never really had the right to leave. So it's a fundamental sort of contradiction. But what happened in that instance is originally the states were repatriated almost immediately. And what they found was that they were continuing many of the former practices from the antebellum South that Unionists found unacceptable. So immediately in 1866, for example, Southern states are holding elections for Congress. They are showing up into Washington, D.C. with their Confederate military garments on, talking about becoming and representing their Southern states again. And that was unacceptable to people who had just been through a very deadly, in terms of human casualties, war. So Reconstruction begins with the first Reconstruction Act, which required states to pass new state constitutions that had open and not racially restrictive voting policies. And that's considered to be the original start of Reconstruction. And that period of Reconstruction goes on for around 10 years. Most historians would give it from 1867 until 1877.
Trevor, it seems that you are also a historian. You know the history of Reconstruction quite well.
Yeah, so my primary field is economic history. And so Reconstruction, it's really interesting that you would mention history because I consider Reconstruction to be sort of this backwater period that people just don't study a lot. There's a lot of literature on the Civil War, a lot of literature on the antebellum era, and then a lot of literature on the late 19th century up to the Gilded Age, for example, and even some burgeoning work, for example, looking at the American West and what people would have called Indian Wars and other sorts of expansionary policies that were going on in the late 19th century. But Reconstruction itself, right, how the United States formed its union again after this tumultuous civil conflict, has been really underexplored um, by both historians, but particularly by economic historians.
Okay, I'm familiar with the history of Reconstruction and William Dunning. I had to do some research on Reconstruction some years ago, so I'm quite acquainted with the literature. Trevon, do you consider Reconstruction as a failure?
I do not consider Reconstruction as a failure. I really appreciate your question coming from the Dunning tradition because that is where the ideas that Reconstruction was a failure really began. One of the things that Dunning was able to do, and I think it's important to talk about historiography here, about and which is the subject of how historians have thought about history. And so the historiography of Reconstruction really does begin in the Dunning tradition, which views Reconstruction as a failure, a failed attempt, for example, to alter Southern institutions, and essentially a waste of time, right? That the enfranchisement of the formerly enslaved, the political gains that happened during that time, the economic policies that were pursued by those integrated state governments, that all of those were a failure because, of course, the South remained economically behind the rest of the country well into the 20th century. Dunning was also very influential because he is the person who advised a ton of graduate students who wrote independent state histories of the Reconstruction era for almost every state in the South. And those reaffirmed the Dunning idea that Reconstruction was a failure, that Black political leadership was inept, and that Reconstruction ended up putting the South further behind as opposed to spurring it further. So I'm coming at Reconstruction thinking of a broader sort of historiography and revisionism that really begins with Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. That book continues to be sort of a bellwether for people who are Reconstruction scholars, and it's a remarkable achievement because Du Bois, it turns out, is right on many of the facts, despite the fact that he was unable to do the archival research that historians would typically do in coming at a topic like Reconstruction. So Du Bois does his revisionist work, and then probably the last or famous word on Reconstruction has been Eric Foner's work on Reconstruction, which is much more consistent with the Du Bois narrative of Reconstruction as being really a potentially great start to a new democratic United States, but that was thwarted by interest. And this is where my paper on whitelashing comes in to that literature.
The response of white elites to Reconstruction was negative. Your paper examines the link between Reconstruction and violence. But before we begin to explain that aspect of your paper, I would love for you to talk about Reconstruction and Black politicians. So
Yeah,
because of Reconstruction, did more Black people enter politics?
yes, and I want to stress that before Reconstruction, there was no Black political involvement in the South, free or enslaved. So the last state that allowed free Blacks to vote was Tennessee, and they had not been allowed to vote for more than 20 years before the end of the Civil War. So there was not a single state in which a Southern Black person was enfranchised before the first Reconstruction Act was passed. So there was no Black political activity before the Civil War. So immediately what you have with the passage of the first Reconstruction Act is the enfranchisement of the formerly enslaved that brings roughly about 1 million people into the political process who had formerly been completely outside of it. And yes, we see tremendous increases in not only Black political participation, which you would obviously expect, but also in the number of African-American people running for and winning elected office. So it really is the first time in the United States that we had race-neutral voting and full enfranchisement in a part of the nation.
Was the response to Reconstruction violent because of tax policy? Because that's the centerpiece of your paper.
Yeah,
The
I think that
perception that whites assume that their taxes were going to enrich Blacks, and as a result, they responded with violence.
they're related issues. And so what I try to do in the paper is sort of cleave them apart and really separate out the issue of sort of just resistance to Reconstruction, period, right? The political Reconstruction that's going on, the social Reconstruction that's going on, the economic Reconstruction that's going on, and then separate that from the actual policies that were pursued by politicians. Because we know that this was a time of tremendous violence. Something around 30%, for example, of all of the race riots that occurred happened around the week of an election, right? So there's a lot of racial strife around politics, but the specific question that I'm asking in this paper is, do we see violent acts against politicians themselves as being related to the tax policies that they pursued when they held office? And what I find is, yes, it is the case that when Black officials were elected into office and were much more progressive with their tax policies than others, including other Black politicians, they were much more likely to be met with violence than other politicians.
Okay. You also noted in your paper that white people monitored the activities of Blacks. Please shed some more light on that component of the paper. How were these people monitored? What did they do? How did they procure information? And how did Blacks respond?
Yeah, so there were a couple of things that people were doing. The monitoring was about Black politicians. They would keep books, for example, on them. They would monitor their whereabouts. They were consistently subjected to threats. But part of that monitoring was also about attempts to control and intimidate the electorate. So one of the things that would happen in the past is you would go, for example, to vote, and they would literally just turn Black voters away. Or they would tell Black voters, if they were the employer, that if they did not vote for the employer's preferred candidate, that they would lose their jobs. And so when the politicians themselves were elected, sometimes they were charged with malfeasance. They were brought up on false charges that they were improperly administering funds and state funds. They were threatened with acts of violence. And in some instances, they were actually denied the ability to even hold the offices that they had been elected to.
Interesting. And how did blacks respond? Because obviously there was resistance.
There was resistance. But one of the aspects of this resistance is that it was not met with a federal response, right? One of the things that we know is that the disenfranchisement process was denying the formerly enslaved of their rights of citizenship. And the United States government, in the waning years of Reconstruction, simply lost the taste to actually enforce the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, the amendment that actually gives us the right to vote free of those restrictions. So they would say things, for example, in Mississippi, that the federal government would send troops to support them in trying to beat back these, sort of latent insurrectionists, if only they could raise their own army. But Mississippi state law at that time was really convoluted about whether or not the formerly enslaved could actually own arms in and of themselves. So it made it very difficult for people because they did not have the support of the federal authorities to actually exercise their rights as free people. It made their resistance efforts relatively futile. And when I talk about the violence that they're up against, there is, of course, the very famous massacre in Louisiana, in which more than 100 African Americans lost their lives. And the whites who were assaulting the courthouse at that time brought in an entire cannon to fire it up on these Black people. So it's not as if they were fighting just with, sort of slingshots and rocks. They were literally up against paramilitary forces who were united in their belief that Black people should not be participating in the political process and should not be citizens. They were literally outgunned and in many instances outmanned.
The Colfax massacre. Even
Yes,
though blacks surrendered, they were still killed.
they were still killed. And remember, the reason there was a massacre was that Blacks had been elected to office. And that was the impetus for needing to have this sort of massacre.
And what role did democratic operatives play in perpetuating violence?
They perpetuated the violence in a couple of ways. One is there was a distinct use of the media to raise hysteria and awareness of the quote unquote problem of Negro voting, right? To make it seem as if Black political operations would lead to dramatic refinements in the social position of white people, right? It really was something that in the media aspect today was really playing on people's fears of racial order being upended. The media certainly played a really strong role at that time. Another piece that they did was there were other elected officials, white elected officials, who would literally say things such as, it's okay to intimidate these voters. I'm not going to prosecute you. So imagine, for example, wanting to intimidate or voters today, and the attorney general of your home state saying, I'm going to allow you to intimidate Black voters because it's okay. So that sort of type of legal case gives people the authority to go out and do these acts, which today, of course, would be illegal. And even when they attempted to prosecute people for these crimes, eventually what the Supreme Court decided was that that's a state matter, that the federal government had no business getting involved in these acts of voter suppression and voter intimidation, even when they were for federal elections. And so that literally, again, takes the federal government out of the position of actually enforcing people's federal rights, right, constitutional rights to the vote, and puts it back on state houses, which themselves have already been captured or recaptured by these conservative white interests, who of course are not going to protect the rights of Black voters.
Interesting. Trevor, comment on the ideology of Black politicians during this era. Were they conservative? Were they progressive in the contemporary sense?
It's very difficult to map 19th century political prerogatives onto today because it's just such a different time. And I think the context is incredibly important. I haven't thought very deeply about whether I think that they would be, Democrats or Republicans today as we understand these parties. And part of that is because the things that they were pursuing were heavily dependent upon the context in which they were operating at that time. So there are two things I find that Black politicians were particularly interested in across states, right, in terms of a general ideology of Black politicians. The first is they were interested in land reform and land reform as a means of wealth redistribution. So in the South, at the end of the Civil War, there's a lot of inequality in the South. And there's a lot of landholding that's held by a very small number of landholders. And this land is particularly valuable because of cash crops like cotton, for example, and tobacco and sugar. And so the South actually has a lot of land in inventory. And the idea that Black politicians had was to take that land and sell it on the open market as a means of wealth redistribution, allowing the formerly enslaved to own land. So it was not a process of direct confiscation of people's property, but it was the policy of raising the taxes on unincorporated or unimproved land for the purposes of pushing it onto the market to create greater wealth equality, particularly to allow freedmen themselves the ability to purchase land and have their own farms. The second policy that Black politicians agreed in was the establishment of a public education system. Consistent with what Du Bois noted in his book, Black Reconstruction, I find that Black politicians were highly correlated with Black economic gains in terms of human capital between the races and within the Black race itself. And we know that the Black politicians in Reconstruction, according to Du Bois, really are the people who invented public education in the South. The South was a highly unequal society before the Civil War, and it didn't have the range of public goods that it would have after the Civil War. And that range of public goods was expanded really at the impetus of Black politicians.
How did Reconstruction shape the politics of the South?
Oh, that's a really big question. I think Reconstruction shapes the politics of the South in several ways. It was because enslavement itself was so racialized, it really was the beginnings of the formation of sort of racial political divides and political objectives in the United States. And I think that carries through to the present in what we see in racial politics and how they play out in the United States. Reconstruction really sets the tone for that. I also think that Reconstruction is an example that I don't think people have sufficiently appreciated until now of the ability of people to capture democratic institutions and turn them into anything but democratic institutions. It should be shocking to us to have something such as a 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which guarantees the right to vote, and yet to have for nearly 100 years after its ratification, very little Black political participation in the part of the country where the majority of African American people are living. That in and of itself shows the contradiction of America's democratic ideals. And that again has its beginnings, its impetus in Reconstruction.
Professor Logan, I am interested in Black entrepreneurship and free people of color. Few books have been written on free people of color. Recently, an American academic, he published a book on free people of color in America. Several years ago, some distinguished historians wrote books on free people of color in Jamaica, Barbados, and St. Kitts. But the literature on free people of color is not as extensive as we would like it to be. So during your research on history, not just Reconstruction, did you find anything relating to free people of color? Is that a topic that you will pursue at some point?
Yeah, I found a little bit of information about free people of color in the South. Of course, there are many more free Black people in the North, and I think we have, excuse me, better information about entrepreneurial activity for free
Yes.
Blacks in the North than we do in the South. I think one of the things that I came away from thinking about, and I think that people don't really understand that in the South, being free and Black was really not freedom as we might understand it, there were a number of restrictions on free Black behavior and free Black agency that were placed in the states of the what would become the Confederacy in the antebellum era. For example, there were states like I want to believe it's North Carolina that said if you were a free Black person, you could move to the adjoining county, but you couldn't move further than that. If you wanted to move further away than the adjoining county, you have to leave the state. And Tennessee was enacting similar sorts of restrictions. What they really wanted, actually, at that time was for free Blacks to leave. And so when you want people to actually exit your state, although they're free citizens, you do things like deny them the right of political participation, you restrict their movement, you actually monitor their social behaviors, right? So you couldn't, in some states, you literally couldn't, as free Blacks, worship at your own church unless it was overseen by a white person. So imagine those restrictions on someone who is allegedly free in American society and the ways that is encumbered, particularly for these Black people. So there really isn't a lot of scope for them, for example, to fully participate in American society. And to your point about entrepreneurs, to really fully participate economically in society. One idea that I really want to emphasize to people who come to this work is that in the United States, because of our capitalist orientation, citizenship is not just defined politically. I would argue that citizenship is simultaneously defined economically. And if you're not a full economic citizen, it matters much less about whether or not you're going to be an equal political citizen. And one of the things that we see consistent in American society is the denial of Black people's economic citizenship.
And I agree to an extent, even today in contemporary America. So there is the issue of occupational licensing, and the research on occupational licensing is particularly negative. But I am shocked that more Black intellectuals don't appreciate economic freedom, because white corporations in America, they will sue for even flippant reasons. If a white entrepreneur asserts that he's only going to employ men with a six-pack, and this has occurred, that does not contradict the law, because the American Constitution has several provisions addressing economic freedom. But in the African American intellectual community, economic freedom is not elevated as central to the Black American experience. So white libertarians and white philosophers, they take economic freedom seriously. That's their human right. So if a Black woman in an inner city community is running a a parlor for if she's a hairdresser and their business is not registered, the state can shut it down. But in the case of a white person, the state has no right to shut it down because she is pursuing her economic freedom. I remember watching TV once, and a white politician, an elderly man from New York, was engaging a judge in discourse. And he stood up and he looked at the judge and he said, "Your power is void. You have no authority." He gave her a philosophical lecture, a quite intense philosophical lecture, basically telling her that as a judge in the Western intellectual legal tradition, she has no authority over him whatsoever because her law is invalid. And the man ranted and he ranted and he ranted. And I was shocked because at the time I said to myself, suppose he had been Black, would he have been able to get away with doing that? Or better yet, would a Black person position himself to act like that? Would a Black person be as equally as informed?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, because I want to go back to a point that you were mentioning about occupational licensing, and also about sort of these restrictions and these non-compete agreements. Those are things that actually restrict the market in many instances for African Americans in particular. And I think it's a really important thing that we actually understand fully that it's what is going on, right? So when we look at sort of these issues of how do these things, for example, like non-compete agreements, affect workers? They do things by limiting their mobility. They're actually anti-competitive forces, right, in the economy. And what people do not understand is people think, oh, a non-compete agreement is something like a doctor, right? You're at a practice, and what you can't do is you can't set up your own shop and steal my patients, right? That because this is this really high lucrative market, and that's why you'd have a non-compete agreement. But you'd be surprised to know that people who, for example, provide janitorial services and security services, for example, are also bound by non-compete agreements. So it's not something that is just used, for example, in high wage, high status occupations to prevent, for example, someone's for stealing your customers. They're used in lower paid service industries as well as a way of restricting labor movement, which of course means that there are going to be declines in wages or stagnation in wages as a result of that.
Exactly. Occupational licensing is uncompetitive, and so charter schools, some people paint charter schools in a negative light. You see that charter schools are racist, but that's not my point. It's not my objective now to argue as to the racist origins or the liberal origins of charter schools. But what I will say is that people have a right to choose. There's a right to choice. And that's so whites on the right view charter schools based on their individual right to choose. They are autonomous people. So for them, it really so for them, the history of charter schools doesn't matter. They have a right to choice. It's a constitutional issue. And equally for blacks who wish to attend charter schools, it's a constitutional issue. It's a free issue. It's not really about the legacy of charter schools or if they're elitist. It's about people, irrespective of race, wanting to choose. And too frequently, some black intellectuals lock people into this vortex of black left-wing politics or libertarian right economic politics. And it doesn't make any sense because essentially blacks, like whites, are people. They can do what they want.
Well, I think when we talk about this, it's very important to understand when we say blacks are like white people, they can do what they want, right? That is something that would I would say Hartman would say is abstract equality, right? And what is abstract equality? Abstract equality is exactly what you're saying. Blacks and white people are just people, and there's no distinction between them in the eyes of the law. But what we know in reality is that there's a really big gap between what the law says and how they view people and the actual application of that law to people's lives. The 15th Amendment certainly guaranteed Black people the right to vote, Black men in particular, before gender restrictions were under the 19th Amendment. But you were not voting, and Black people were not voting in states in the United States in clear violation of the 15th Amendment for a very long time. So under the law, in the abstract equality way, we could say, well, why aren't Black people voting? But we know why they're not voting, because there are extrajudicial, extra legal things placed upon their agency. And similar things can happen in education and other fields as well in the economy, where there's this idea that we have equality, and there is equality in the law, but there's absolute inequality in social practice. And so the question that we continue to struggle with in America that I think Reconstruction highlights is a period of legal equality that is simultaneously visited in a period of extreme racial inequality. And the end of that period was not one in which the social and economic realities matched the legal realities. It's one in which the legal world was assuming and working under equality that had no applicable reach into the ways that people were living their lives. What's worse than that is we live in a system where we should be able to depend upon the administration of justice to bring about the equality that we see under the law. But that itself was also thwarted at that time. And so what I always tell people is the law's freedoms and the freedom of the law, the law's freedoms that it gives you is only as meaningful as you can actually exercise it. That's what's critical for people to understand. that freedom legally might or might not, and in many instances in American society, it has not meant anything materially for how Black people could go about their day-to-day business.
All right. So before I continue the conversation, I plan to do a part two. I'm going to end this Zoom meeting soon and send you a second link. But let's talk about Black entrepreneurship, intergenerational wealth. Have Blacks been adept at transferring intergenerational wealth? And if the answer is no, why is this the case?
But we know from the work by Laura de Court that there was an increase in Black wealth holdings immediately after
Yes.
emancipation. That would not be surprising.
Yeah.
The intergenerational transference of that wealth has been stymied. And I think one of the things that we have to understand is that this is where the role of policy comes in. The work of Dania Francis has looked specifically at Black wealth destruction, and particularly in the form of farming, where Black land is essentially stolen from Black people. We know experiences, for example, of white capping, in which places in which Black people held wealth were literally run out of town and had their wealth stolen from them historically. There were many assaults on Black wealth holding, including the Tulsa race riots, which probably is the most famous example that people would think to. But there are many instances, number one, of simply restricting Black people from having access to wealth. Two, African-American incomes being so disproportionately low that they lack the vehicles to wealth building, right? In other words, they cannot go out and acquire wealth because they are so poorly paid. And then three, attempts to actually do acquire wealth and intergenerationally transmit it are themselves thwarted by legal processes and politics, which seize Black property and redistribute it to white Americans. So there's been a lot of theft of Black wealth over time. The work that Sandy Darity, for example, and Kristen Mullen have done in their recent book shows, for example, the ways in which wealth has been taken from African-American people at a rate that's simply not seen for other groups. And so that, if we just look at intergenerational transmission, we would say, oh my gosh, Black people don't intergenerationally transmission their wealth, but there are a lot of policies and historical circumstances which prevented the successful transmission of Black wealth.
But I've written arguments against reparations for slavery, but there are other arguments for reparations. So, for example, elite Blacks during the Civil War, their properties were destroyed. They didn't get reparations. Their properties were wiped out, and you refer to legislative policies that impeded business formation. The descendants of those people, they didn't get any reparations. And
Yes.
furthermore, as a descendant of a slave, you are less likely to accumulate human capital. Gregory Price had a recent study on the topic. Therefore, if freed people opt to create wealth and are impeded by the state, then there is a case for compensation.
Yeah, I think one of the things is that we have to understand two things, is that the end of the Civil War left Black people free in every respect. They were free of bondage, and they were also completely free of resources, right? This is not a typical way. That's free in every possible way. Now you go and you survive in a capitalist society, literally with nothing, right? So immediately upon emancipation, Black people are dependent upon the existing wealth structure, right? They don't have the ability. The vast majority of Black people, there's a very small percentage of Black people who are actually free at this time, but the vast majority of Black people have no means to acquire wealth. They have been fundamentally and systematically blocked from acquiring human capital. And this is why the Black politicians sought on both ends to ameliorate those conditions. And here's the thing that people don't think about when they're thinking about reparations and other sources of this. The largest source of wealth redistribution in United States history has come from the federal government's transference of wealth to white Americans. Literally, the federal government in the United States from the antebellum era and the Northwest Ordinance onward simply gave a lot of land to white people. They gave a lot of property to white people. The moment it became an issue was when they wanted to give property to Black people.
And
Then it became
put it,
unused.
contextualize it. Are you referring to homesteading?
I'm referring not
Yeah,
only to homesteading. This is
yeah,
very important. I'm not
yeah,
only referring to
yeah.
homesteading. You have to understand it's an entire operation of a series of wealth transfers. Homesteading is only part of it, and we know that that was racially disparate. It also refers to the Northwest Ordinance, which sold land at far below market rate prices. It also refers to land that was literally lotteried off. If you were a white man, you got a lottery ticket to land, for example, in the state of Georgia in the antebellum era. So there were literally instances in which land was given away to white people from the federal government. That is an absolute wealth transfer. And so it's beyond homesteading. Homesteading is only one example of these types of wealth transfers. People have even looked, for example, at the GI Bill itself and its benefits, again, which are racially disparate, as a wealth transfer. I've looked at the Civil War pensions, again, from the federal government, redistributed. Those are also income and ended up being wealth transfers, but they were racially disparate. So we still see when people are talking about, I don't want us to give these things away, the government has been giving a lot of things away to people. So you're either going to want to get all of that stuff back, or you need to make an argument of why this group of people don't deserve to get something from the government because you've given it certainly to almost everyone else.
All right. So thanks for coming on. I'm going to close this link and send you a new link within a couple of minutes.
Okay. I need to get off of this in I'm booked till 12:45.
12:45. What is the time? What time is it now?
It's 12:37 right now. So I have 8 more minutes.
12:37. All right. Okay. Then yes, 8 more minutes. Okay. So coming soon. All right. Bye.
Okay.